you have ever worked in a corporate job, or maybe you've worked at an office where there's a lot of older employees, maybe some people who are Gen X or boomers, you'll often run into sort of a common problem, which is you see an issue or you see a way that your colleagues are doing things, and you notice that there's kind of a obvious flaw that could be easily fixed. You'll bring it up to your boss or a colleague, and you'll get the response of, well, that's just the way we always do it. And it never gets done because they don't want to rock the boat. They don't want to have to train up everybody else on a new system, which might be more effective, so it stays the way it is. And that kind of entrenched thinking is in every sort of industry: entertainment, politics, healthcare, law, sports. In hockey, there's been a lot of talk about fancy stats, analytics, and all of that stuff, with some pushback still. And that's meant that we've moved away from a lot of the quote-unquote bad stats, like plus minus is hardly ever used anymore as an evaluation of whether or not a player is good defensively or not. Because we understand that just boiling it down to whether a player is on the ice for goals or not doesn't really paint the whole picture. And there's one other stat that I think is kind of outdated that we continue to use almost unthinking, and that is points. Every hockey fan knows what the point stats are. It's goals plus assists. We give out awards to the players with the most points. We rave about players' points per game. But therein lies the problem, because in my opinion, points is based off of a faulty assumption, which is that goals and assists are worth the same. And I think there are two main reasons for this. If you were explaining hockey to somebody who's completely new to the game, somebody who had never heard of it, never seen it, had no idea what it was, they'd probably ask you, what's the point of the game? And if you wanted to tell them in the simplest fashion possible, what you would say is the object of the game is to put the puck in the opponent's net more times than they put the puck into your net before time runs out. Because that is the core essence of hockey: score more goals than your opponent before time expires. And so somebody hearing that description would naturally think, well, the two biggest skills that make somebody an elite player are being able to either put the puck into the net or keep the puck out of your net. And while there is certainly a lot more nuance that goes into how a team scores goals and how they prevent goals from being scored, that is essentially correct. We judge the outcome of a hockey game on how many goals are scored, not how many goals and assists are scored. A goal in a game of hockey counts the exact same, whether it is assisted by two people, one person, or unassisted. And also logically, assists are completely dependent on goals. You can make the ideal pass. You could be an incredible creator, but if you pass it to somebody who just shanks every shot, you're not going to get any assists. The outcome of whether or not you get an assist is largely outside of your control. Whereas you could get a lot of really bad passes, but if you just shoot them on net and they manage to go in, it counts as a goal. Goals are the fundamental measure of any game of hockey, so it makes sense that they should be worth more than assists. But there's also the fact that there are just fewer goals than assists. On any given goal, there can be 1, 2, or 0 assists. And last year, there were about 9,000 goals scored and about 15,000 assists recorded on those goals. And basic economics lesson, the more common something is, the more of them that there are in the supply, the less that they cost, or rather, the less that they are worth. So last year, there were 1.67 repeating assists for every goal scored. And that ratio means that every assist is worth basically 0.62 of every one goal. Yet the point statistic treats every goal and every assist counting exactly the same. But the analytics site Hockey Reference actually has a better stat, in my opinion, for measuring offensive output, called goals created. Let's use that context to revisit one of the statements I made during one of my preview videos about the Pittsburgh Penguins, where I said that Sidney Crosby is not as good as Connor McDavid or Alex Ovechkin because he has played with much more help on his team than either the other two did. And before we get into the specifics, I want to acknowledge really quick that I actually was kind of wrong in that statement, and I'll explain why. But I wasn't entirely wrong, and I'll justify why I still think that opinion still holds water. Over the course of his career, Sidney Crosby has a career goals created per game of 0.46. We're going by per game because Crosby missed a lot of time due to injury and stuff like that, so I want to make it on the per game basis to get ahead of the argument that the stat doesn't reflect the time that he's lost. This is on a per game basis. And I'll link to all of these stats, by the way, in the description of this video. So Crosby's at 0.46. Connor McDavid over his career has a 0.55 goals created per game. Okay, he's ahead of Sid. Now Ovechkin's goals created per game over his career is 0.46. He's tied with Sidney Crosby. So offensively, they have been equally as efficient. But what I said was that Crosby's had an advantage over those two as he's gotten to play with better supporting players, notably Evgeny Malkin. And let's take a look at Evgeny Malkin. Over his career, his goals created per game is 0.43. He's just behind Ovechkin and Crosby. So it seems fair to say that Sidney Crosby got a lot of help by being able to play with Evgeny Malkin, who has been almost as efficient offensively over his career as Crosby has been. But a lot of people retorted in the comments, well, Ovechkin got to play with Backstrom, McDavid gets to play with Draisaitl. What about those two? And this is where I was wrong, because Leon Draisaitl's goals created per game is actually higher than Evgeny Malkin's. It's 0.45, just below Crosby and Ovechkin, but still higher than Malkin. So Connor McDavid has actually gotten a lot more help than I gave him credit for. But I would also counter and say that McDavid is way ahead of Malkin, Crosby, Ovechkin, and Draisaitl. They're all very close together. McDavid is on a whole other level. However, I will concede that I was wrong to say that McDavid has not gotten help the way Crosby has, because Leon Draisaitl has been as offensively productive as Crosby and Ovechkin, and more so than Malkin. But then there are the people who retort, well, Ovechkin also gets to play with Backstrom. Nick Backstrom's career goals created per game is 0.32. The gap between him and Alex Ovechkin in terms of production is bigger than the gap between Connor McDavid and all the other players that we've talked about. In fact, if we look at the gaps between the three pairs of teammates, the gap between Ovechkin and Backstrom is the biggest, then McDavid and Draisaitl, because McDavid is on another planet, and then Crosby and Malkin are the two closest in terms of their productivity. So yeah, I was wrong to say that McDavid has not gotten the same level of help that Crosby has. But I was right to say that Ovechkin has not. And Ovechkin has performed as efficiently as Crosby with less help, while Malkin, with the same amount of help, has far outperformed Crosby. Last year, Connor McDavid was #1 in the league in goals created per game. Alex Ovechkin was 17th in the league. Sidney Crosby was 25th. There have been 6 times in his career where Crosby was not the leading goals created leader on his team. By contrast, that only happened twice to Ovechkin and once to McDavid. The simple fact of the matter is that Sidney Crosby has played with one of the best supporting casts in the NHL for years now, and that has been a large contributing factor to his productivity. In fairness, Connor McDavid has also gotten that same privilege by being able to play with Leon Draisaitl, who is a bona fide superstar in his own right, but McDavid has vastly outproduced Crosby. And those who allege that Alex Ovechkin has had a similar level of support as Crosby had throughout his career is just plain wrong. Nick Backstrom is a great player. I love him to death, but he is not on the level of Malkin or Draisaitl. And despite having the worst supporting cast around him of the three, Alex Ovechkin is still equally as productive as Sidney Crosby. Oh, and of course, he's on pace to pass Wayne Gretzky as the all-time goals leader. So the simple fact of the matter is, when we're talking about the best players of this generation, you got McDavid and Ovechkin up top, and then there's everybody else.